The Summer Games Minute, brought to you by Mass Mutual. It is one of the most coveted trophies in the world, but are gold medals really gold? Well, mostly, they're not. The gold medals given out these days are nearly entirely silver and are plated with pure gold to give them that iconic sheen. Silver medals are, of course, made with silver, and bronze medals are a combination of copper and other metals like tin or zinc. And while winning an Olympic medal is priceless, the value of the materials in the medal are not. In recent games, some of the materials used to make the medals have come from recycled cell phones. Mass Mutual celebrates women's sports history and understands the nuances in how women want and need to manage their finances. With quality product solutions and guidance, a Mass Mutual financial professional can help you plan for both short-term and long-term money goals. Learn more and get started at massmutual.com.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold! Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
The Athletic.
The race is on, and the snappily named Visa Cash App RB team revealed its new car in an all-star Las Vegas launch. Not that the team showed much interest in telling people about it or letting fans have a glimpse. But what should we expect from the former AlphaTauri squad in 2024, and why is it making so little effort to make anybody care? I'm Edd Straw, and joining us with all the answers are Ben Anderson and Scott Mitchell-Malm. Well, Scott, we'll get straight into it. We'll do our best to start off with a positive tone on this one, so let's go with the good of the launch.
What launch? the random drop of a few. I felt like the renders are like, I don't know what it is, but like some renders look more real than others. Like some look a bit more cartoonish, and this felt like a little bit more of a slightly cartoonish one. So yeah,
I have to say, Red Bull
launches...
teams have a little bit of a history of sometimes going quite post-production on some of their images. I remember once some years ago, Red Bull managed to do themselves out of an Autosport cover in favour of another car because they post-produced their launch images so much to look shiny and fun and hilarious that they just looked dreadful. So we actually had to put something else on the cover because they'd gone too far with it. But anyway, I digress.
Yeah, so the launch such that it was basically the drop of some renders online and then a few assets being sort of published on their website and on their YouTube channel. And the best thing about it is that the livery is, we've got colour on the grid. We've got flashes of colour elsewhere on the grid, but we've got a car that actually looks colourful in this kind of pretty strong throwback to the late Toro Rossos, the blue and the red and the silver of that car. I think this car looks quite good from the side and kind of three quarters. I don't really like it from the front, and I can't tell why. I don't know if it's because it's a bit like, everything just looks a bit like thick and blobbed on, and it's just a bit strange. It almost gave me, do you remember the last Team GB A1 Grand Prix car? The one that was predominantly blue with the base, when you looked at it, and it's got like really thick red lines and bits like that. It kind of gave me a little bit of vibe like that from the front.
It's a bit Union flag, isn't it? I suppose
it is a little bit, I suppose. But it's nice. It's nice to see a different livery and one that's actually got some colour, and that is pretty much like the car itself. We don't need to get onto that just yet. Like the car itself has some nice bits on it, but in terms of like what the team has done around its rebrand and its launch, the livery is about the only nice thing I can say about it.
Yeah, well, they don't seem that interested in the launch as a whole. They didn't stream it. They didn't make much effort. They didn't. There were loads of fans you could see on social media. They knew roughly what time it was, and that was difficult enough to find out. But they didn't do the courtesy of just saying, "Oh, by the way, you're not going to be able to see anything really from this." You know, great. They put out images, fine, but that baffled me. Just the whole approach to it. It's great. Okay, you've got this Las Vegas launch. You've got Kendrick Lamar. You know, this is the showbiz breaking America version of F1, but it all seemed a little bit, well, we're having a great time, but no one else is allowed to see it.
It looks like there were some media there, but from the people I've spoken to, not a lot of people had any details about it. And there are elements of this that, yes, made our job harder to do, and that's fine because it's within the team's right to do it. But it's little things that just didn't seem to be taken into consideration. That just the fact that the fans just didn't need to know what was happening when or where and didn't need to be able to follow it. The fact that just from our side of things, what I don't understand is, I've asked the team this and I've just been blanked. I haven't had a reply. Is normally once the car's launched, every team does this, and this team has done it in the past. They put out like a press pack alongside everything, and
they actually historically have done pretty good ones with some pretty good technical stuff.
Yeah, exactly, because they've got Jodie Eggington, the technical director, who normally gives really good insight in these sorts of things, right? And it's fine if we're not part of the launch event. Don't mind about that. They're not obliged to put on Zoom interviews or anything like that around it. That's absolutely fine. But the bare minimum, generally speaking, is to put out a press pack with some information and some insight, especially when you're rebranding, launching a whole new identity and trying to make a big splash. And you've basically done the bare minimum to make fans aware of it and make people be able to cover it. It just struck me as really weird, and like the priority was just for the people who were there in Vegas, which we can basically summarise as VIPs and sponsors and people that they want to schmooze.
The thing I don't understand is they're making a big deal about creating this team identity, yet they seem to have been completely inept and cack-handed in doing it. Now, the identity itself, this RB thing, is pretty dire, but they've not communicated stuff well. It's like everything they're sort of saying is, oh yeah, we're trying to make this really proper and big and everything, but they've done it all just so badly. You're right to say that at least the car will stand out amongst the other cars. The livery does look good.
I think it looks better than the old livery, the AlphaTauri livery.
But it doesn't, because it looks almost like the old Toro Rosso livery. That's the thing I don't understand.
Yeah.
You say you're going to create this exciting new brand, but they haven't. They've gone back to an old one while removing all sense of identity from the team. It just makes it sound like they don't care. It makes me want to get a MasterCard. The whole thing just makes no sense.
I would say, Ed, I think your suggestion that the rebrand is dire and the way they've done it is cack-handed, I think it's because you don't understand the team name. Would you like me to explain the team name to you?
Oh, please elaborate.
Because it's really easy. Okay, so the company itself is now called Racing Bulls. That's been named after, because Dietrich Mateschitz, the Red Bull founder, had his flying balls, the plane collection. So call this new racing team company Racing Bulls. And the idea is, according to CEO Peter Beyer, you give the team then some identity without sponsors, because sponsors can change, and he's acknowledged this. So the company's called Racing Bulls. So obviously you call the team RB instead of Racing Bulls. And of course, that RB doesn't stand for Racing Bulls, it stands for Red Bull. And just to tie a ribbon on it, you've got that Toro Rosso-esque livery. How can you not understand that, Ed? Is that not crystal clear what the identity of this team is and why they've called it what it is?
I think this just brutally exposes my lack of marketing credentials, because this is obviously some kind of masterstroke.
You just don't get it. That's your
problem. From the outside, from what I see a great company that was built on brilliant marketing in Red Bull across the board, proving completely inept at it. That's the impression I get. So I'm pleased you've corrected it, because everything you said there made perfect sense. The only thing I'd suggest is maybe they need to add the word hit to the end of some of those names, because that would make a lot more sense to me. But there we go.
I think they need a bit of... I've said this a few times when we've discussed this internally. It feels like it needs a little bit of a with or a by in the name somewhere. It's like Visa Cash App by RB with Racing Bulls or something like that. It just feels like it's going to be that really sort of two-bob team name. And I think the thing that upsets me most about it is they're kind of trying to justify it, and some of the people who have defended it have made this argument as well. It's like, team sponsors are always in names, you just ignore them and go with the underlying identity. But my point here, my issue here is not with Visa and Cash App. I don't care about that. It's the fact that if you take that logic, which the team CEO has espoused, then Visa, Cash App, RBF1 team, that means that RB is the team name. But RB, as I just explained, apparently relates to Red Bull, not Racing Bulls, even though the company's called Racing Bulls, and that's meant to be the identity.
And that's on the entry list, the Racing Bulls, as company name.
So it doesn't make sense. They've just ended up in this really jumbled garbled situation where they've created branding and they've trademarked racing balls, but that doesn't feature at all. It's just it's a big mess, and it's not the same as Mercedes AMG Petronas or BWT Alpine. It's not the same as those. They've done a fundamentally worse job with this rebrand.
Well, also, it's looking and sounding much, much less independent, even though there was this whole idea that it was meant to stand more on its own and be more of a contributor to the overall Red Bull involvement in F1. It feels like it's just being sort of gradually assimilated into the mothership, and the lack of effort, shall we say, in the launch, the confusing identity, the naming situation, which, even though you tried to explain it, Scott, does actually make no sense at all, just feels like a sort of symptom of that identity crisis, effectively, is what it is.
Yes, it's just Red Bull. It's so Red Bull 2 now.
Yeah,
that is all. That's all it is. And I feel because we joke about it, and I have some fun with my sarcastic explanation, and I desperately want to spend the whole season calling this MasterCard Google Pay F1 team now going forward. But
it could be sponsors change, Scott. So it could be 2025.
But the underlying identity will always be Racing Bulls RB Red Bull, and that's what matters. The thing I feel sorry for is, we joke, but it's good, serious racing people in that organisation that have effectively become part of that joke and become the butt of a joke. And I don't see how you can say with a straight face that you represent this or like this team in its current form. And you just, I don't see where when it was Toro Rosso, and even when it was AlphaTauri, when it sort of still had its own, it did its own thing within the Red Bull stable there. It wasn't as effective as Toro Rosso, and I didn't like that rebrand, but it's better than this. But especially when it was Toro Rosso, I loved that for a few reasons. Primarily because even though it made it so clearly part of the Red Bull family, and it was clearly a Red Bull team, I said this to you, Ed, didn't I, when we were discussing it yesterday? Because that touch of making it the Italian for Red Bull was such a lovely, subtle link to its heritage as an Italian team in Faenza. But now, more that Faenza influence and importance is being stripped away. There's still going to be elements of the team base there, but they're putting this new facility as part of the main Red Bull campus in Milton Keynes. And it just feels like I say, what made this team what it was, in name, in spirit, in heritage, is all being eroded just so it can become a corporate, faceless, bland, pale imitation of Red Bull Racing, and just be a second Red Bull team that sits there, takes up space, very possibly contributes something. I think it could be competitive this year. I like their driver lineup. I like the people that work within that team. But it is just an extension of another team that exists in Formula One, and that's the impression that they're giving off with the rebrand and the way they're going to go about this in the future.
It unquestionably reflects a changing Red Bull wider company because, like you say, it erodes that team identity which is carried over from the Minardi days. An interesting point is that there was a point very early on when this team was for sale because Red Bull bought it kind of under pressure from Bernie Ecclestone and the FI. It's like, oh, we need help. So they got it, and they thought we'll make it a junior team, and they sold a bit of it to Gerhard Berger and then acquired it all. And it was officially for sale for a while, and it was sort of tacitly could be for sale for a while. But Dietrich Mateschitz always had a condition attached to that, which is it has to stay in Faenza. And of course, he passed away a few years ago, and now it seems to be undoing some of that legacy. But this whole thing about the corporate identity is one of the things that corporate identities tend to do is they end up being this sort of collaborative mishmash that just sucks out every bit of individuality. Because if there's any kind of strong identity or individuality, it can't help but be divisive. People can only like something if there's enough in it for people to dislike it, if you see what I mean. And I think that's why it creates this completely empty vessel identity that they're not going to pour anything into. So they create this sort of almost dislike that we're expressing just by there being nothing. So you get the dislike without any of the positive. It just seems really awfully done. I mean, maybe being unfair, but just the whole thing makes sense. I only worked out earlier that Visa Cash App was two separate sponsors as well. I thought it was one product. So they've not communicated that very well. And yeah, like I say, once again, makes me very favourable towards MasterCard. I'm going to keep saying that.
It's begging to be sold, maybe, this team, isn't it? This whole
sounds
kind
like
of
it.
Strange mishmash of name, lack of identity, slight nod to the past, being moved effectively, like you said, Ed, the dismantling of the Mateschitz era continuing apace. It's lacking that injection of somebody. It doesn't have to be just a big corporate, although obviously that's what Formula One like. They would like an OEM or something to take on teams, but it's begging for somebody interested, like an Andretti type, to come in and just kind of inject a proper new direction, not this kind of Red Bull vessel, if you like.
I don't like the fact that the way this has started, and it might improve from here. They might realise that they've misstepped. They might course correct a little bit with either the identity or the way that they go about things. But it's a problematic opening to the era in that everything I've seen about the rebrand, the new identity, and the launch suggests that this is now a team with interference from above that is prioritising style over substance. And if I compare that to what we saw from Alpine when they launched their car this week, one of the things I took away from the way they launched their car and the way they've talked about this season is I see a bit of a positive shift for them in the other direction, where they moved away from a really over-the-top launch last year, which was so style over substance, and they've made people like the Renault chief Luca Di Maio less front and centre. I genuinely don't think most people listening to this could pick Alpine CEO Philip Creeth out of the lineup. And that's the way that kind of corporate side of things should be. There's an emphasis at Alpine now on we need to kind of redefine the way Renault's F1 team goes about things. And I like that. It doesn't mean that they're going to be successful. It guarantees nothing. But it is a shift for the positive. And again, I come back to that point about serious racing people at the team formerly known as AlphaTauri, formerly known as Toro Rosso. They are serious racing people, and the beauty of a small team like this is that they had a clear purpose. They were there to race. They were there to be plucky underdogs, effectively, but they were always trying to punch above their weight. And now it's an organisation that seems to be kind of saying it wants to get closer to the front, but really it kind of just exists now to fulfill other purposes, more commercial purposes, more corporate purposes, and I really don't like that. That's not where this team has sort of made its name, ironically. Pun not intended, given that it's just had another terrible rebrand, but it's just it's not the right direction.
You can't even argue really that it's the junior driver training ground anymore, can you?
It's not.
That was something that was essential to what the team was, but with Daniel Ricciardo in there, who's eight-time Grand Prix winner, and Yuki Tsunoda, who's in his fourth season now?
Yeah, it's fourth, yeah.
And they, this Liam Lawson kid that they dropped in, but then they've benched him again. It doesn't have any kind of really clear purpose other than, as Scott says, we know there's a good core racing team within there, but it seems to be being pummeled by this kind of weird new post Mateschitz Red Bull corporate mission.
Politically stupid as well, given there's a lot of pressure on the complaints about them supposedly colluding. And actually, this team, Red Bull, has always actually, I think, been quite respectful with the way it's operated the second team. And I think some of the accusations, even last year, were massively overblown. But everything they're signalling says that's exactly what they're doing, that it's going to be...
It's a terrible look. It's a terrible look.
Yeah. But it just seems to me that nobody's sat... I mean, what Peter Byer's doing, if he's meant to be running that team, and he's not sat there and said, no, hang on. There's so much wrong with this. We've got to do better here. I just don't understand it. And people will be listening to this and thinking we're being harsh or whatever, but team identities do matter. And like we said, it's not a problem having the sponsor name in it. That's fine. It's the fact they've deliberately subsumed everything to push the sponsor name over and above everything and just given it no identity, no purpose. And they're obviously moving into a big chunk of the team into Milton Keynes later this year. That's kind of the autumn that's going to be happening. Again, in itself, not a major problem, but it was always going to draw criticism. So that's what I just find so bizarre. There's this incongruity as sort of highlighted. They're talking about this becoming more of a team in its own right, while everything that they're signalling and doing says it's becoming less of a team. And if I was working that team, I'd be thinking, hang on a minute, is this a place we really want to be? Because a good team spirit was fostered and preserved there. I think Franz Tost actually did quite a good
a good job there in that regard of things. He was always pushing that team to be more than just accepting its lot as a second team. Didn't often, pretty much never, when he set a target pre-season in terms of championship position, did it achieve
fifth.
it.
We have to be fifth.
The ambition, I think there was fourth one year, but
really,
the ambition was always there, and I think, like Franz Tost or dislike him, and he has a certain reputation for being quite old school and demanding, but I think there was always that, look, this is a competitive race team. We're not just going to fade into the background. We're going to keep trying. And whether or not you achieve that is one thing.
Well, he was a workaholic as well, wasn't he, in that team?
Well, exactly.
So,
but it creates that racing team spirit. Yeah.
Did you remember this time a year ago? I'll test your memories, when we were preparing for what was then the AlphaTauri launch, the final AlphaTauri launch. And one of the ideas we had around it, which I think we slightly finessed the headline, and maybe it was the video title we did as well, but the core question around it, which was something I think I pitched when we were just in discussion, was effectively the shorthand version of it was, what's the point of Red Bull's other F1 team? That was the way we that was the discussion around, right, how do we then how do we develop some content around this, a written piece, a video, whatever. And it wasn't with actually using that exact phrasing in mind, because we were, I think, all aware that was a little bit too harsh. But the point was basically to question, what's its sort of long-term objective here? What does this exist to achieve, and how's it changing? That question, that original blunt question, what's the point of this team, feels more relevant to me now. Now that they've tried to relaunch it and give it a purpose, I feel it has less purpose than ever and less clarity than ever. And I'll say it again, it's a really worrying start to this direction.
If I had to guess, I'd imagine Red Bull basically wants it to go racing for less outlay and bring in more money. And they've moved that dial by basically saying, well, if we absorb as much of this as we can, then it's less expensive to operate a whole separate factory in another country and blah, 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 do more of the car on a cheaper basis. And then if we can make it closer to our own car, which is obviously setting the trend for competitiveness, then it will finish higher in the Constructors' Championship and will bring in more money without spending as much.
It's got a huge vibe of the perceived bottom line being a huge factor in what this team does, and I've got no problem whatsoever with the intention of, how do we get more from something while paying less for it? How do we make a team more efficient? That's fine. That's actually the way modern F1's going. Every team's having to make that consideration. Yeah. This isn't the way to do it. Strip away all of the core things that made this team good. And as I said earlier, just make it a sort of pay a limitation of your main team that is also at the same time is this weird extension of it, and just try and get basically 2 for 1 on your F1 commitment. That's not what this is meant to be, and we don't need to go into this discussion now, because we'll be here for an hour talking about this. But F1 being a closed shop, saying no to the likes of Andretti and General Motors just to have 20% of the grid taken up by a single ownership, and have 2 teams that are basically collaborating as much as possible and having almost imperceptible differences going forward. That's not good for the second Red Bull team, but it's not good for F1 either overall.
It's also odd because that whole rebranding thing, I remember going to the launch of the first AlphaTauri where they did the rebrand, and that was at Hangar 7 in Spielberg, so that's a Red Bull facility. So it felt very Red Bully, but they had the fashion show there. They made an effort to give it a bit of an identity. I actually think that AlphaTauri rebrand worked pretty well. Knew what AlphaTauri was. They tried to give it a bit of a fashion injection. I don't think the AlphaTauri company worked quite as hoped in terms of being a Red Bull fashion brand, but I thought it was a bit weird, but it
made more sense. It made more sense.
Yeah, it managed to give it a sense of identity while still marrying it to Red Bull. But this has just failed spectacularly on many levels. But just very, 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 very odd. Well, in a moment we'll get into the details of the car with Gary Anderson before returning with Ben and Scott for more. But before we get into studying the snappily named VCarb 01, I wanted to tell you about an amazing offer that we have right now for the Race Members Club. For a limited period, we're offering a 1-month free trial membership, meaning you can enjoy everything the Race Members Club has to offer, including exclusive members-only podcasts, a reduced ad environment on the website, exclusive access to the race.com comments section, member discounts, and much more, before we take any money from you. We've posted members-only podcasts, including full-length interviews from the Sauber launch recently, and we have lots of exciting extra audio content planned for testing too. So what are you waiting for? Sign up today and enjoy a month on us. You can find full details on how to join by clicking the link in the description to this episode.
You know we love talking stats here at The Athletic. Here's one that's super simple to remember. Discover automatically doubles the cash back you've earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cash Back Match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back to $300. That's right, you could put it towards some memorabilia you've had your eye on or treat yourself to a premium sports network. You earn and Discover doubles. See terms at discover.com/credit-card.
We'll get back to the pod in a moment, but first of all, let me tell you about Grammarly. Email, Google Docs, Slack, you write across multiple platforms and places during your workday, so delivering consistent, high-quality communication everywhere is key. Grammarly is an AI writing partner that helps you get work done faster with high-quality writing for better projects, proposals, presentations, and more. Best of all, Grammarly works where you work, so you can get more done no matter what tools you use. As a journalist and podcast host, I'm constantly writing and rewriting copy and drawing up scripts. It's part of the job, and Grammarly helps make it faster. It's got some really cool features like tone suggestions to help you strike the right balance between direct and friendly in work emails. Plus, Grammarly has a ton of other great features like advanced spelling, grammar, punctuation, and conciseness suggestions to ensure your writing is professional, mistake-free, and clear. Get AI writing support that works where you work. Sign up and download for free at grammarly.com/podcast. That's grammarly.com/podcast. Easier said, done. Well, I'm delighted to be joined now by Gary Anderson, who's been through his fair share of F1 car launches on both sides of the fence. Gary, what do you make of the new V-Carb 01, as it's not so snappily named?
V-Carb 01. Well, personally, I like it. I mean, I suppose it's the paint scheme to begin with is quite nice. It's a bit better than sort of the black cars that we've been seeing, to be honest. It's just got some nice lines about it, but you know, going a bit deeper than that, I do think it's actually quite a good package. Now, I've only seen, as I say, the renders and a few pictures, but it's difficult to know what we'll actually end up with when we see it in Bahrain. But if it's anything like what it is, and obviously there'll be small detail changes, I think they've gone out on a limb and they've definitely improved.
And it sounds like they're managing expectations a little bit early on, but they think they've got a car here that they can work with and develop. So let's get a little bit into the detail. I think a lot of people will be expecting this to be a complete clone of last year's Red Bull, and I guess that's the obvious comparison point. So what do you make of it in those terms?
Well, I don't think it is. Now, the one thing that for sure will help them is the fact that they're having a closer relationship with Red Bull. So suddenly your company gets a lot bigger, because a lot of the stuff that they're getting from Red Bull, i.e. the front suspension, let's say the rear suspension and the gearbox, it's a major part of the car. It's a major part of design time. And if they don't have to do that, they just buy it in, it's not necessarily any cheaper, but it doesn't take good people. You don't have to get good people because Red Bull have those good people. So the people you've got, you can focus on the rest of the car. So suddenly your company becomes quite a lot bigger. I'm not sure what the percentage would be there, but it's a big amount. It's 30-40% for sure of the design group. So as far as the car is concerned, obviously the regulations allow that to happen. The regulations state, I think, is you got to design your own aerodynamic surfaces. Anything that's licked by the airflow should come from your own pencil. So the performance of the car we know comes from the aerodynamic surfaces, but the mechanical control of those surfaces needs to be in place. And there's probably no team that had a better handle on that than Red Bull last year. So I think as what we're seeing now is a car that will benefit from that. If we start at the front of the car, again, whenever I saw the Alpine, I said the nose was a bit bulbous, But this is just, this is exactly what I would sort of go for, trying to get that airflow off the top surface around the sides of the car. You want to get the maximum airflow you can, the maximum good high energy airflow in between the wheels and the side of the chassis, because that's what the rest of the car's got to work with. Obviously, you generate this outwash if you can on the front wheel, but that's to try and take away the bluffness of the front wheel. That's to try and camouflage the front wheel and allow the flow that hits that front tyre to go around the outside as opposed to going inside. So, everything there is pretty good. I would have pushed for the slot gap on the front wing main plane where it joins onto the nose. Red Bull have a slot gap between that main plane and the nose. On this car, it doesn't. It's one of those sort of connects up, so they got the flow around the side. But I think to get the undersurface of the nose working as well as possible, that slot gap is quite important, because if you have that slot gap there, you can have a more aggressive underside to the nose. In other words, you can raise it up quicker and higher to pull more airflow through there, because the gap underneath the chassis to the ground is connected to the gap between the chassis and the wheel. So the opening for flow through the front of the car there is a U shape as such, level with probably the top of the chassis. That's the area of flow you want to maximise, and that slot gap helps you achieve that. So they don't have that. The front of these noses is a little cover panel, because there's a very low energy required for that first part of the impact test to make sure that the surface area that hits, or the surface area that generates the high loads for the impact test, isn't small enough to sort of punch through the sides of a chassis. So there is a room there to change that front part of the nose fairly easily. Not that I'm saying they will do, but it is possible. Next thing we go to, obviously, is the front suspension, which, as we say, it's just off the Red Bull, because you can do that. It's a mechanical package of components. I'm sure
it should be, based on history, it should be the 23 spec suspension that they take. They did get some latest parts towards the end of last year, but they're normally year plus one, although they've been a little bit sketchy about that.
Yeah.
Looking forward to getting to the test and checking whether they've succeeded in getting some more modern stuff, but just thought it was worth mentioning that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with that, because it's fairly well proven. The stuff from 23 didn't do too bad a job on a Red Bull, and it's seen 22 races last year, whatever, 23 races plus sprints and all that sort of, all the mileage. So it's fairly well proven. It's not as though you're hanging yourself out there with a bit of a risk with some new stuff. So I'd say for the team as it is now, there's no deficit in having the 23 stuff, unless Red Bull come up with some magical system that we haven't seen yet. But I would think it would have the anti-dive on it that we've seen to support the car under braking. You can't see the top wishbone rear leg in these pictures that we've got, but I'm pretty sure it's all there, the same as Red Bull last year. So nothing really to see there, I suppose you might call it. The leading edge and the undercut and the radiator intake duct is not dissimilar. Again, the other three cars we've seen this year so far are not dissimilar either. I wouldn't say this is a clone of a Red Bull. I see no reason why it shouldn't be a clone of a Red Bull, not because of their association, but just because of the performance last year. The one thing that does sort of jump out a little bit is the aggressiveness of the surface underneath that radiator intake. That it's a huge turning moment. If you looked at them way back in the old days when you had barge boards there, that was always very aggressive, that surface. But with the barge board, you had a vertical vein. It was an inside and outside surface, so you could get the flow to attach to both surfaces and have a big turning moment on the airflow. This is more of a blocker, really turning that airflow underneath there, and it's a combination. The edges of the floor, again, which I'm not quite sure if they're going to be what we see in Bahrain. They're a bit different. They've got a sort of longitudinal slot gap to that outer vein that they've got mounted there. And that aggressive flow, it could be a combination of both. It could be that slot gap that pulls that airflow around that very aggressive surface, or it could be that aggressive surface helps work that slot gap and that turning vein. So all that combination is about working that front corner of the floor harder. The more air you can extract out of there It works like a sort of its own little mini diffuser, I suppose you might call it, working that front corner of the floor, allowing the airflow that the diffuser really has to work with to be more towards the airflow on the center line of the car. So you've got these vertical veins in the leading edge of the underfloor, which turn that flow that's, I suppose you might call it, near the wheel. It's a bit turbulent, that turn that airflow outwards, allowing good, clean, tidy airflow through the middle of the car to go right through onto the diffuser. So yeah, I mean, I used to say it's all sensible, and there's you can come up with very logical reasons for most of it. So not too bad in that area. I think it's a good step forward, and it's different, slightly different. So it's going to be interesting.
Yeah, we are expecting to see certainly an evolution of that floor come the actual running in Bahrain. They're going to shake down the car, I think, on Monday at Misano, so we might get a proper look at it there. But it's interesting, isn't it? Because as you say, there's some differences in the aero, and in fact, this car has never been a clone of the Red Bull. This team historically, except if you go right back to when they could run customer cars in the first 4 seasons, that was then outlawed. They've always gone to an extent their own way. So I guess the key is for this is whether they've got their own aero concept right, and that's all about the underfloor, and then things like the side pods and the way you deal with the front wheel wake, and all these things are kind of feed into that. But then it's whether they could get that working with the mechanical platform control they've got. So I guess that's we're saying this with all the cars because that's so important, but that's the key for them, isn't it? They've got this great mechanical platform tool that's so well proven. That, I guess, is the key for them. If they can make that work and the aero works well with it, then there's actually quite a lot of potential there.
Yeah, there is. As you say, they've always tried to stand on their own 2 feet for many, many years. And when James Key was there as technical director, that was one of the things he pushed for with Franz Tost. Now both aren't there anymore. It's a whole change of management and design structure and the whole bit. So they are using their association with Red Bull to get what's allowed in the regulations. And as I say, it makes the team bigger. But it's one of these sort of situations. Controlling the aerodynamic platform with the mechanical side is very important. The big thing is your aerodynamic platform good enough? I can see a car that has good aerodynamic platform but not good aerodynamics being just okay. But it should be quite consistent because the aerodynamic platform will be around you at all points in time. They might not have the downforce, and they might not have the downforce characteristics right, but it should be a better car to sort of understand and then develop. So I think it's the right thing to get right first, your control of the aerodynamic platform, because then, as I say, if it's not controlled, you just start scratching your head because every corner's a new experience. So if you can control the platform well from the high speed to low speed during that transition of braking and corner entry, then, as I say, you'll get consistency out of it. And if you get consistency out of it, it'll point you in the direction better. So I don't doubt the fact that they will have a fairly good aerodynamic platform, but there's so much detail that needs to go into it to make sure it's a very good aerodynamic platform. I doubt very much if they have the expertise at hand, initially at least, to really have that package that could challenge Red Bull. I think it's one of these sort of things for them now as a team, as they've sort of gone away from being a driver training scheme to something different. They have experienced drivers in the race winner and Daniel Ricciardo. It's been a while since he's won a race, but it's shown that he has the talent. So if they can give him the tools, I think they can come up with the results. But it's one of these sort of things where they have set themselves up now as a team to justify their own existence in Formula One. Yes, with the help of Red Bull as far as parts are concerned, but they're not out there to train drivers anymore. They're out there to score points, finish better in the championship, get more money out of the championship, and reduce the cost to Red Bull, in effect. So it's a big year for them. They're definitely going to have to take a step forward from where they have been in the past. We can say that with all teams, to be honest. If you look at the top 3, maybe 4 teams, from there on backwards, any of them could become the 5th team by just getting it a little bit better because it's so close in that midfield. So it's going to be a very interesting season.
I guess the positive thing is they did make good progress with the floor edge modifications that were introduced during the course of last year. Had a strong finish. Is there anything else technically on this car that catches the eye, or are you going to have to wait until you see it close up in Bahrain, the real car, to get into a bit more detail?
I think in reality, the cars will change by the time we get to Bahrain, and we can only look at what they release. And I'm never a great believer in renders and basing too much on it, because these are quite clever people. I mean, they camouflage some bits and pieces in the renders to make them look different. The details all there, the rear wing end plate, the flap arrangement, all of that stuff's there for the drag reduction that has become a requirement. It's one of these things. Formula One's changed a lot. We've got two types of scenario. One, you're out leading the race on your own and DRS isn't used, or you're following somebody and DRS is used. So it's become, every detail has to count, because you never know the scenario you're going to get yourself into. And I think that as long as you have those all those small details all lined up together on the same chassis, you're going to be in pretty good shape. So I think, as I say, looking at this car, it looks as though everything's there in a pretty decent shape. The slot gap along the floor, the longitudinal slot gap with that airflow coming in around the front corner of the floor, is a bit different from last year. But as you say, they made good steps at the end of last season with their floor edge detail. So if you made good steps last year, you probably understand what you're trying to achieve out of it fairly well. And I would assume that if this ends up being different in Bahrain, that they've achieved more out of that. So that's how you progress. You take a step. Did it correlate with your thought pattern on the track? And then you try to extend that a bit further. So I'm sure that's what they've done with this car. So I'm looking forward to seeing it, because it looks a neat and tidy package, and I like the colour scheme.
Well, a good solid thumbs up from you there then, Gary. They'll be pleased to hear that. Interested to see how they get on. So thanks very much, Gary. We'll let you get on with your day.
Cheers, Ed.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Well, back now with Ben and Scott. Great stuff from Gary Anderson as always. But Ben, while RB doesn't seem very interested in making an impact off track, performance on it will ultimately dictate how much attention it draws. So Are you expecting it to build on the promising end to last season?
Yeah, they're the danger team, I think, in that lower midfield group, aren't they? I think some of the justified complaining about the dual ownership of teams, singling out effectively Red Bull, and Zach Brown has been banging this drum quite loudly, as we know, is because of a slight fear that this team could just effectively use Red Bull's slipstream to just vault up the championship. And that will be the aim, as we've discussed, to try and rake in more cash. The easiest way to do that is to turn 8th place in the championship into 6th or 5th or 4th or whatever, and actually achieve one of those Franz Tost targets that they never achieved in their Toro Rosso days. So they were quite impressive towards the end of last year. The development direction, they switched Silverstone time, I think it was. Tost said he was quite aggressive in forcing through changes in personnel, as well as a change of emphasis aerodynamically. I think Ricciardo being plugged in helped as well, having that experience from various different teams and race-winning pedigree, giving them a way of driving that was different to before, to build the car around or build the developments around. And they could have easily have been 7th. It was pretty close if Yuki Tsunoda had a slightly better strategy in the final race, or managed to pull off that one-stop strategy. Didn't quite work. So they could easily be 7th if they can maintain that slope. I guess the big question is whether they've shot their bolt by doing all that work in the second half of last year, as other teams were kind of winding back and focusing more on this year, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out with Williams, because they did very little, I think, after Canada last year, and they're talking about big changes this year, different methodologies. Alex Albon's talking about the car having a different characteristic completely, so it'll be more competitive on more tracks. So it's really, for me, Alpine I think are too far out of reach at this stage. So it's a case of really fighting over seventh, unless the suspension changes on what was the AlphaTauri, now the V-Carb 01, are absolutely transformative in a massive way. I don't see them jumping into the top 6 fight. So it's really a battle between RBs, Red Bull, Racing Bulls. I don't even know what to call them. It's so confusing. What should we settle on? What's the easiest way to refer to them?
I think it depends on whether or not you're trying to refer to Red Bull Racing or the Red Bull Racing cars in the same sentence. If you're not referring to any of the Red Bull Racing RB suffixes, then you just about get away with calling it RB. But if you start talking about the Team RB in the context of what it got from the RB19, for example, then that becomes a painful mouthful. But actually, speaking of what they got from the RB19, that suspension change, while delivering a lot of potential, could trip them up in the beginning, because it's a significant change with the kinematics, and that can be just setup wise difficult to understand and optimize. But then they still have to do their own aerodynamics, and you can do a good approximation of what Red Bull did visually. We've seen lots and lots of teams, not just the ones that share architecture, take visual cues from the RB19 with the sidepod inlet, for example, and the way that they the way that they're fashioning the top surfaces of the car.
Well, McLaren made a massive step, didn't they, by kind of following a Red Bull direction and picking up on it early. Aston too.
So you can do that from the outside. You can do that from what you can see and what you're sort of working out is what they're trying to achieve, then testing it yourself and developing it yourself. But they still need to do all that themselves, and they still need to do it properly. They could have a mechanical platform now that catches them out in terms of the operation of it trackside, or exactly what the aerodynamics need to maximize it. And they could also just not do as good a job on the aerodynamics. Like they could trip up there. So it's one of those where it's not, to my mind, everybody always last year were making jokes about whether it would be an RB19 copy, and almost talking as if it was the same situation as the pink Mercedes when Racing Point copied Mercedes for 2020. But one, the rules were tightened up after that, so it's not quite the same. And two, Racing Point, I think, actually did probably at the upper end of what you can do there in terms of actually pulling it off. I think they did a really good approximation of the Mercedes. But that doesn't mean that anyone who tries to just copy another car will have the same success, and that this team will be scoring podiums this year or anything like that. There's just as much opportunity to get it wrong as there is get it right.
Yeah, and it's worth stressing that although they're using the same wind tunnel, they share the Red Bull wind tunnel, they moved into that ahead of 21 season, the aero development has to be completely separate. Now, you can make claims about how much leakage there is, etc., etc., but the FIA works quite hard to try and check that there isn't the collaboration. They go through CAD trees and that kind of thing to make sure all is in order. And we should also add that Red Bull, or RB, the second Red Bull team, has gone nowhere near as far as, say, Haas has in terms of the amount of parts it's taking. They still seem to be picking and choosing quite a bit. And although it was sort of...
And also, if there was proper collusion aerodynamically, you'd expect a team like Haas to do much, much better than it has been doing, given that it uses the Ferrari wind tunnel, wouldn't you? So
exactly.
I'd imagine those systems are pretty robust. And like Scott said, in the wake of the pink Mercedes scandal as it was, which obviously specifically only referred to quite a narrow part of the car in the end, didn't it? It was to do with the brake ducts.
Well, in terms of what was actionable, yes, it was the rear brake ducts, because they had the design the year before, but they'd never actually run them because it didn't fit in with their concept. They were illegal because brake ducts became a part you had to design yourself between those two seasons.
Yes.
But if you'd run someone else's previously, it was grandfathered, but because they had the design, but they hadn't run it, therefore it wasn't grandfathered. So really, it was just one little bit. But that case did lead to the tightening up a lot of rules about
lots of holes,
scanning cars and that kind of thing.
Which also, that whole thing also related a little bit to Haas, didn't it? Because there were questions constantly about their brake ducts in the period just before this in terms of being a bit too close to Ferrari. So I think that's why that became a non-listed part when previously it was a bit less clear. But anyway, yes. So I think for racing bulls, let's just call them racing bulls, they seem to be in a good place towards the end of last year, but you can get a slightly skewed sense of their potential based on the fact that they're, as we see up and down the grid, there are a few teams that are kind of out of sync, having gone, oh, we've got the wrong idea here about these ground effect rules and our aero concept, we need to switch. And you can take Aston at one point in time. McLaren obviously made a switch just as they were starting last season. Mercedes did theirs slightly later than that. Ferrari are kind of doing theirs, I think, in keeping with a nice winter cycle. They're doing it now. Racing Bulls kind of did theirs mid-season last year and then went for it on development right through. So there's room for them to be overtaken by teams that make a big leap going into this season, like Williams, like Stake/Sauber, because they seem to have done a similar thing, some quite serious changes. Haas, I'm obviously not so convinced about. They kind of set their direction with Austin and so much turmoil at that team, and they're even talking about a slow start. So I think not a huge amount to worry about from behind. Maybe Sauber, if they really have unlocked some secrets to that car, which wasn't too bad in some circumstances, just a bit inconsistent. And that might be a threat from behind. Williams, you just don't know. We know they can be strong in a certain type of circuit, more straight line and less high-speed corner. If they've made a big change and it works, then they could be a big threat. But if, again, like Scott was saying, you can trip yourself up. If they've tripped themselves up, then it's probably a free run for Racing Bulls because they've made their change and it seems to be working. It's just a case of how much runway they still have in having made that change in terms of development. But I still feel like it's a big leap. The top 6 teams seem to me to be out of reach for teams at kind of this level that Racing Bulls are at.
How about the drivers, Scott? There's going to be an enduring storyline about Daniel Ricciardo. Is he going to get promoted to Red Bull, the main Red Bull, not RB? And there's still question marks about what's going to happen to Yuki Tsunoda as well, who's, he's chipping away, he keeps making progress. There's still untapped potential there, but he's an interesting case as well. So it's one of the more fascinating driver lineups from that perspective, isn't it?
Well, it's brilliant because there's a bunch of different ways this can go. You've got a situation whereby having had that kind of teaser to his comeback in full last year with the two events and then the extended spell on the sidelines of injury and then the runner race at the end of the year, Ricciardo comes back fully fit, fully focused, full Mexico spec Ricciardo basically, and does a great job all season. Proves that he's the driver Red Bull need him to be, and he's a serious contender for the Red Bull racing seat that Sergio Perez currently has for 2025. Ricciardo could fluff his lines, not do a good enough job, not look strong enough at all, and wipe himself out of contention. Yuki Tsunoda could. I don't think there's. Bit of a big claim. I don't think there's anything Tsunoda can do this year to get himself a Red Bull racing seat in 25 or ever. I feel like that decision has been made internally. He is not considered a Red Bull racing caliber driver, right? Unless
there's a miracle season. I think you can't rule that out, given and I do mean a proper, if it's a proper brilliant season, he could force himself into that equation just through being there under their nose. But I do take your point that
possibly
it would take a hell of a lot to change that, but it can't be completely ruled out. It's just very unlikely.
It's just my opinion. I'm not saying it's. I just think I don't think he can change the prevailing view of him internally, even though I think, as I think we discussed on different podcasts, like I think there's an argument that at the moment he's the best option, he's the strongest option, the fastest driver, the most consistent driver outside of the Red Bull Racing pair at the moment. So in a normal or another situation, he might be the best placed candidate. But I think he can do a great job this year, further his own credentials, and make it really awkward that Red Bull aren't prioritising him. Or the absolute worst case scenario for Red Bull is that neither's particularly impressive. Ricciardo beats Tsunoda at a few races, Tsunoda beats Ricciardo at a few races, the rest are a bit of a mixed bag, and the car's not good enough for them to make a particularly compelling case for themselves. So there's lots of different ways this can go. The one relative certainty I have for the drivers is that if one of them has a better season than the other, I think it's curtains for that other driver. Because I think if Tsunoda... I don't think either driver's going to bury the other, but if Tsunoda has objectively the better season than Ricciardo, I think that just undermines Ricciardo too much, given the prevailing opinion about Tsunoda. And if Ricciardo bests Tsunoda, then any potential, Tsunoda's getting it together, that momentum disappears. I don't think there's any sort of overwhelming backing for him. And it might not necessarily change anything for Ricciardo if people go, oh, well, he's only beaten Tsunoda. But it would just be more damaging for Tsunoda if Ricciardo beat him. So I think there's a lot at stake for the two drivers just in terms of their reputations based on the job they do against each other. If you could just take that in a vacuum, irrespective of what happens with the Red Bull seat going forward, just that Ricciardo versus Tsunoda fight for one another is quite significant.
Yeah, it's really interesting because there's that whole dimension of, does Ricciardo necessarily need to be better than Tsunoda? Does he just need to be better than Perez in terms of his longer term ambitions? So this is going to run and run, I think, this whole thing. But it's a shame, isn't it? Because I think there's reasons to be positive about the car. They've got quite a nice driver lineup. So there's some good stuff going on there. It's just a shame that all the stuff we talked about in part one with the identity is completely shrouding that and undermining it. But I don't think we're going to be able to do anything to change that. But they're going to run, I think, at Misano on the 12th on Monday. So that car will be shaken down before the Bahrain test. And going to be an interesting story to follow over the season. I'm sure a very controversial one as well at times, given how many people have it in their sights. Thanks very much to Ben and Scott for your insight. Head to therace.com. Don't forget the hyphen. Loads to read there, including Gary Anderson's technical analysis and all the coverage of the launches so far. Check out our other podcasts, including Bring Back V10s, the Race F1 Tech Show, our IndyCar Formula E and MotoGP podcasts, and head to YouTube as well for long and short form videos. It's 4 down, 6 to go for new car launches, so stay with us for everything you need to know from the world of Formula One.
The Athletic.